Welcome to the seminar series on contemporary challenges in European spatial development, which is organized jointly by the EPRC, European Policies Research Center, and the section Spatial Planning and Strategy at TU Delft. My name is Eva Burkhardt-Hofer. I'm a researcher from TU Delft, and I have the honor to chair this meeting and seminar today. And this is the fourth event in the series and the first one that is held online. Of course, a little bit of a bummer that we cannot be in the same room, but there's a silver lining. I think we have people joining from all over the world, which maybe wouldn't be possible if this was organized in real life. So welcome, everyone. Before I briefly introduce our speakers, I just want to inform you that we are recording this meeting and it will be afterwards available on the web pages of the section of Spatial Planning and Strategy of TU Delft. And our main speaker today is, of course, Lewis Dijkstra, who is going to tell us about how everything we heard about global urbanization is wrong. So looking forward to hear about that. Lewis is the head of the economic analysis sector of the DG Regio in the European Commission. And he's also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Lewis holds a degree, a PhD in urban and regional planning from Rutgers University in New Jersey, and also degrees in planning and politics from London School of Economics and Ghent University. And recently he has been working on the topics such as the global definition of cities and rural areas, the geography of EU discontent, the quality of government, and gender equality. And after Lewis will give his lecture, we have two discussants who will be the first ones to comment on the presentations. The first discussant is Dr. Alexander Wandl, who is a senior researcher of environmental technology and design at the Department of Urbanism here at TU Delft.
Hello, everybody.
His research focuses on developing sustainable urbanization. For example, he's developing an extended territorial metabolism approach that integrates methods and tools from different disciplines. And recently, he has been specifically interested in the challenges related to the sustainable development of dispersed urban areas and peri-urbanization in Europe. And our second discussant is Dr. Martin Ferry, who is a senior research fellow at the EPRC. He holds a degree in politics from the University of Strathclyde and a PhD in Central and East European politics from the University of Glasgow. And Martin's research focuses on the governance and implementation of national regional policy and cohesion policy. And he has been specifically interested in the institutional frameworks of regional policy, as well as the themes of policy coordination, institutional capacity, and accountability. So these are our three speakers today, but of course we also want to hear from the audience. So there will be an opportunity in the end of the session to ask questions from Lewis or also from the discussants, of course. And for this purpose, to keep everything organized, we would ask you to post your questions in the chat, and then we can pick those at the end. And depending how much time we have left, either I will post the questions to Lewis directly on your behalf, or we will give the floor to you so you can ask yourself. So this is everything from my side. Very warm welcome, and Lewis, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to present this. It's a novelty online, but I do appreciate the wider coverage geographically that we get with this. So, and I want to tell you about a topic I've been working on for the past 10 years or so, and it's about urbanization and how we can measure that in a more comparable way. I've not been alone working on that. I'm actually leading a coalition of 6 international organizations, and you can see them on the screen there. It's the EU, FAO, ILO, OECD, UN Habitat, and the World Bank. And it's already hard to get a consensus inside an international organization. To get 6 international organizations to agree among each other is even harder work. So I'm actually very happy that we now actually have this definition that I'll be telling you about, endorsed by the UN Statistical Commission in March this year. It's a recommended method for international comparisons, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. If I'm hitting the right button. Yes. So I'm sure some of you have used data on cities. Some of you have used national data on cities, national definitions. Some of you may have used international data, particularly the UN World Urbanization Prospects. Some of you may have doubts about that data. Others may have used your own definition or somebody else's definition. But the difficulty is everybody uses their own definition. It's very hard to compare. And it's also very hard for knowledge to kind of accumulate, to build up around an analysis of a system. And that's why harmonized definitions are so important. And why did we start this work in 2016 at the global level? Well, we had the UN Sustainable Development Goals and we had the new urban agenda, and there was a great demand for harmonized indicators to be collected for cities, for urban and rural areas, but there was no method. There were detailed guidelines on how to measure the indicator, but zero guidance when it came to how to decide what is rural, what is urban, what is a city. And so if we want to be able to compare those numbers, we need a global definition. And also, if we want to understand global urbanization, hence the title of my presentation, we really need a global definition. And now the curious thing is that most countries actually don't have a statistical definition. They rely entirely or in part on administrative designation. Well, what does that mean? It just means that you decide how many cities you have or how many urban areas you have. Now, in the case of, say, Monaco or the Vatican, it might not be so hard. The territory is quite small. But if you have a large country, obviously, it might still be an accurate description of your territory, but it's not one that another country can replicate. So it's really tricky for them then to say, okay, well, am I more urban than you are? If everybody just gets to pick what is urban, it's difficult. Now, the other countries do have a statistical definition, but they use different thresholds, different spatial units, and different indicators. So also those are not particularly comparable. And the difficulty especially is that SDG indicators that we want for rural areas are highly sensitive to the definition. For example, China says any settlement under 100,000 inhabitants is rural. Well, if you include settlements of 50,000 in your rural areas, guess what? A lot of them are going to have electricity. A lot of them are going to be covered by a mobile network. There's going to be tons of roads there. In Denmark, you have to be smaller than 200 inhabitants to be rural. Now, Denmark is an affluent country, so maybe they will still have good access to electricity and drinking water, etc. But it just shows you the scale of the differences in the thresholds being used. And it's not just a problem for the rural indicators, it's also a problem for the city indicators. Quite a few are very sensitive to where you draw that particular boundary. Access to public transport, for example, tends to be high in the city center and much lower on the outskirts. A settlement not at the center, pollution's concentrated in the city center, and the demand on land is so great in the city center that there is often not a lot of open space there. Now, this is not just my opinion. I can even demonstrate it with data, which I always like to do. So here, for 5 capitals in Europe, we measured the share of population that can't walk to a bus stop or a metro stop or a tram stop. And so we start from the city center on the left-hand side of the screen, and there pretty much everybody can walk to such a stop. Very high concentration of public transport stops there. But as you start to move away from the city center, the share of population that cannot walk to them quickly is increasing. And by the time you're about 10 or 20 kilometers, you're already up to 30, 40% of the population that no longer has that access. So it really demonstrates, depending on where you put that cutoff, how well you're going to perform on this particular indicator. Actually, it also means that if you want, you can actually game the system and say, ooh, I want to look good on this indicator, so I'll take a tight boundary. Ooh, I need some more funding. I need to justify that I need funding. I'll take a broad boundary. And that's, of course, the opposite goal of what we're trying to do when we're trying to compare cities. We don't want to game the system. We want to learn from each other and find out who has good access and who has not. So the simple question that we need to answer from an urban perspective is, where does a city stop? And here in the case of Chicago, it's a good question because it looks like the city seems to go on forever, but you really need to just find a simple method that you can apply everywhere. Global urbanization. we've talked a lot about it. The latest UN World Urbanization Prospects announced a huge tsunami of urbanization, massive increases of urban populations in the future. But even simple questions like, is Egypt more urbanized than Brazil? How can we answer that if we don't know, or if we don't agree on how to measure urban? Moscow bigger than Istanbul? We can find different numbers for both cities depending on the concepts and the definitions that we use, but never can we find it if we don't use the same definition. So also the link to economic development, and I'll get back to that in my presentation, is really key. And also with an eye to the future, we need to be able to understand this better. So already alluded to it, the population thresholds countries use differ radically. You can see China there at the far right side of the graph, using a threshold of 100,000, Japan 50, Mali 30. But then the vast majority of the countries, 85% of them, use a threshold somewhere between 200 and 5,000. So typically they think medium-sized settlements between 5 and 50,000, they typically think of them as urban. However, they sometimes add additional criteria, which changes that classification. And so here are the countries in dark blue that don't have a statistical definition, so purely rely on designations. And then in the light blue, you can see the lightest color, you can see the countries that rely primarily on population size and density indicators. And that's what's behind the definition I'll be introducing. But before I introduce the definition, I do want to acknowledge that defining a city and a rural area is not easy. That's why it hasn't been done before. And I'll try and explain to you why it's easy. Now, I'm glad we've got a couple of participants from Scotland here, because according to a population size threshold, this would be classified as an urban area. Now, it doesn't look like an urban area. It's actually Plockton. It only has a population of 378, but it's part of the Highland Council, which has a population of almost 250,000. If you're going to pick a threshold for what's urban, 250,000 should do the ticket, right? But the difficulty here is that that Highland Council encompasses such a large area that you get a very large population, even though this place is clearly rural. So, I'm not the first person to bump into this problem. So people thought, wow, we can fix that. Why don't we use density? But then you get a different problem. Then this becomes a rural area. This is Ulaanbaatar. It has a population of 1.4 million, but its density is less than 300 inhabitants per square kilometer. So if you would pick an urban density, Barcelona or Paris, you're thinking of 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. You're not thinking 300 or less, right? And so Mongolia was actually concerned that their capital would turn out not to be a city because of its density being so low. So for the geographers on the online event, I was going to say in the room, this is caused by the modifiable areal unit problem. So if you use geographic units of a different size, you get a lot of distortions. And these are two key examples. So we found a way of trying to fix that. And basically what we do is we don't use units that change in shape and size. We use the same shape and size everywhere, the little squares. It's called a population grid, and we use them at 1 kilometer. And so here, this is a population density map of Veenendaal in the Netherlands, not too far from Delft, close to the Hoge Veluwe. And you can see two little circles there. And on the density map of the municipalities, you can see one settlement very clearly, and in the other one, there's nothing there. You don't see the density. But if you look at the grid, you can clearly see those two settlements. And it's thanks to the grid that we can actually identify settlements consistently across space, which we can't do if we use municipalities that change in shape and size. So what do we do? It's relatively simple. I can put it on the back of a napkin. For a city, we need to first define an urban center. So we want at least 50,000 people living in cells with a density of 1,500 inhabitants. And those cells have to be contiguous, i.e. they have to be touching. To be a town or a suburb or a semi-dense area, you need to have at least 5,000 inhabitants in a cell with a density of 300, inhabitants per square kilometer, and the remainder of the cells are rural. We've applied this to South Africa, and this is what it looks like at the grid level, all those little square kilometers, and you can see Durban right there in the center. And then we use that in the next step to classify local units. Here we introduce the local units a little bit again, but if they're quite small, you get a good fit between the grid concepts and the local unit concepts. And they're purely based on where the majority of your population live. Your majority lives in urban centers, you're a city. Majority lives in a rural grid cell, you're a rural area. And if you don't have a majority neither, you're a town or a semi-dense area. This is Durban again, and we've applied this to their named places. These are aggregations of census enumeration areas, and it looks like this. And you can see a pretty good match between, on the one hand, the concepts at the grid level, and the other hand, the concepts at the local unit level. Now, why are we doing this? The main reason to do this is because we have very little data at the grid level. I love the grid, but I can't get administrative data, I can't get survey data, or only with difficulty. So if I can link it to a statistical or an administrative or political boundary, I can get a lot more information. And it's also easier to talk to the people who have, who are in charge of those areas. So if you talk to a mayor, you want to be able to provide them figures for the areas they recognize, and those typically tend to be administrative. What we've also done is we included 3 classes. So we don't think the world is black or white. We wanted to introduce some gray. And so we introduced this urban-rural continuum, and we have this class in the middle. It's neither big urban, not a city. It's not really rural. It's somewhere in between. We call them towns and semi-dense areas. Think of semi-dense areas as either suburban or peri-urban, depending on the country. And here is where we found a bit the surprise. You could call it the invention of a town. Town is a tricky word. In lots of languages, they don't have a name for that. They might have a name for city. They might have a name for village. But that in between is quite difficult to name. A couple of languages I'm familiar with, Dutch, German, French, Italian, Spanish, they don't really have a word for that. So maybe in your language, that's also an issue. It might be a word for really, really small places like hamlets, but this middle category is ambivalent. And this also shows up. This is a bit of a complicated graph, but let me talk you through it. We tried to compare the degree of urbanization with national definitions. So on the left-hand side, you see the cities classified by the degree of urbanization. And we checked what share of that population that live in cities according to the degree of urbanization is classified as urban. And in most cases, it's 100%. It's a little bit lower in Uganda, Morocco, and Vietnam, but still very high. And then on the right-hand side, we looked at all the areas we defined as rural. Do they also define them as rural using national definition? And in many cases, the consensus is very high, 90, 80%. A little bit lower in Portugal and France, because they also include some urban areas there because they have a very low population threshold. We use 5,000, Portugal and France use 2,500. But then in the middle, that's where the messy bit is. And this is why global urbanization is so distorting. Half of the world thinks a town should be urban, and half of the world thinks a town should be rural. And here you can see perfect examples of both. Towns in semi-dense area are 99% urban in Portugal and France, and more than 90% rural in Vietnam, and also India and Morocco, very high shares of that population are classified as rural. So we're basically seeing that because of this middle category, we're getting very confused or very different definitions of what is urban and what is rural. And so rather than trying to decide who's right, we thought, why don't we put it in the middle category? It's useful to understand these intermediate settlements. So we've tried to isolate the area where there's a lack of consensus to trying to agree. We all agree that a big city is a city or urban. We all agree that a really rural area is rural, but it's just in this middle category that there's some ambivalence. At the request of the FAO, we also further disentangled this definition. From 3, we've gone to 6 classes. and this is particularly useful in the rural areas, which cover 99% of the globe, we introduced some differentiation. So you can identify villages, which have between like 500 and 5,000 inhabitants, dispersed rural areas, and then really mostly uninhabited areas. And also the towns and semi-dense, we split them into towns between 5 and 50,000, and then the suburban or peri-urban areas. We weren't done, because the difficulty is if you're trying to capture the economic impact of a city, you have to look beyond the city borders, and you have to look beyond the dense core of the city, but you have to take on board the commuting zone, because that's the true extent of the labor market, and so that is what we have done there too. If you look at what we've done here, we take that same urban center, we take that to define a city, and then around that city, we define a commuting zone. A commuting zone is very simple. It's every municipality that sends 15% of its employed population to the city for work. So you've got at least 15% commuting going on. And if you combine the two, you get a metropolitan area. And lots of countries actually have both an urban-rural definition and a metropolitan, non-metropolitan definition. So we also offer both. So this is kind of like maybe a bit more technical side of the presentation. I'll conclude. And now I want to take a look a little bit at the policy implications and the projections of this work. Because it's obviously not neutral, and it makes a big difference in how we see the world. And I want to start off with, say, the motivation of this project. Remember, I said we want to monitor SDG indicators in a reliable and a comparable way. So we came up with a very neutral definition, just looking at size and density of population. But if you look at the UN census recommendations, it actually says, oh, you might want to include the availability of electricity or piped water in your urban and rural definition. I'm like, hold on. One hand, you want to include that in your definition, and on the other hand, you want to monitor that in these areas. I mean, you can't have that on both sides of your equation, right? If you can only be urban if you have electricity, then all your urban areas are going to have electricity. If you're only allowed to be rural if you don't have safe drinking waters, then all your rural areas are not going to have safe drinking water. So there's really a problem of circular argument there. So we recommend don't put these things in your definition. Kick them out so that you can monitor them. And that's what we've done. So together with a team of academics led by Vernon Henderson, we looked at the demography of health survey. And so this is a large-scale survey done mostly in the global south, looking at a number of issues important for health and development. And here, this is access to electricity, and you see the little triangles, those are the cities. And virtually everywhere, you see that cities have better access to electricity. And you know, the differences can be massive. For example, in Guinea, it's 70% of their city population has electricity, and rural areas, it's 5%. I mean, these are really big differences. The only outlier is Kenya, where it might be that some of the city slums lack electricity, whereas the more affluent suburbs and towns may actually have electricity. But you can really see a big gap. It also makes you realize that depending on what you do with your middle category, you're either going to make your cities look bad or your rural areas look better. Because if you add it to the cities, your share is going to drop. If you add the towns to your rural areas, the share is going to increase. So again, it's important that we define the areas in the same way so we can compare across countries. You can look at drinking water, you know, another one, the important SDGs. And again, big disparities between cities and rural areas. Typically, cities are the best. And it's because they have economies of scale. People live close together, there's a lot of demand within close proximity, so the cost of providing it is lower, which is probably why more people have this access now. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't provide it to rural areas, don't get me wrong, but it explains some of these discrepancies that you can see here. What you can also do is you can work with geospatial data. So we found a paper in Nature, I believe, that had the location of every healthcare facility in sub-Saharan Africa. And so you can start calculating what's the average distance to the closest healthcare facility. And you can see that cities, it's typically between 1 and 2 kilometers roughly. Then in towns and semi-dense areas, okay, it's up to 3. And then in rural ones, it's up to 5. So 5 kilometers on average, that's an hour's walk, right? If there's a halfway decent path or road. It can be a lot longer if there isn't, and this is the average. That means some places are even further. And you can break it down, and then you can see that actually villages tend to score better, and dispersed rurals tend to score worse, and mostly uninhabited are really very far away from any healthcare facility. So you can clearly see the impact that has, and also the impact that has on health. So if you look at health issues, you see a higher concentration of those in rural areas. Access to public transport, another important SDG indicator. And here we check this for a number of cities. This is the classic indicator, just, can you walk to it in 500 meters? And you see in the European countries, this tends to be very high. 90% or more in most cases. North America, a little bit mixed, quite low in Houston and Atlanta. And then Africa, wide range, from almost 80% in Cape Town down to less than 10% in Ndola and Luanda. So wide ranges. If you have the right data, you can also break it down by frequency. So it's not just a question, okay, can I walk to a bus stop and do I then have to wait 1 or 2 hours for the bus to show up? You can see, are there at least 4 departures an hour or 10 departures an hour? And then you can see that typically in Europe, the frequencies are high. Also in Africa, the frequencies tend to be high. In North America tend to be a lot lower. Layout of some of those cities makes it quite hard for people to get to the public transport stop, and they have to cover long distances. So a lot of people choose to drive, and so the frequencies of the public transport there tends to be a lot lower. Even decisions on fertility, how many kids to have, seem to follow in most cases the pattern of a degree of urbanization. There's this story that if you move to a city, that it's likely that you'll have fewer kids, and this is again confirmed by this data from the Demography and Health Survey. In virtually all the countries, cities have the lowest fertility rate, and rural areas the highest one. So these are big differences in these countries, but virtually all of them, except a few in the cities, are still above the replacement rate of 2.1. So we still are going to see big increases in the population there. We looked at 2 other issues. This is from the Gallup World Poll. We coded all their microdata that was done based on face-to-face interviews and in the US by degree of urbanization. And that coding is available free of charge. So if you have a subscription to their microdata, you can do this analysis yourself as well. And so we looked at the question first linked to ending hunger. Do you have enough money for food, or in the last 12 months, did you lack enough money to buy food for you and your family? And the numbers are really quite sobering. I mean, in rural areas and low-income countries, 2 out of 3 people said, yes, this happened to me during the last year. I also found it interesting to see that it was higher in rural areas, given that, the preponderance of agricultural activity, they're actually closer to the production of food, but they struggle to be able to afford it and to provide it. In high-income countries, we don't have a large sample of high-income countries because quite a few have telephone interviews for the World Poll, and we weren't able to code those all by degree of urbanization. But in general, the numbers are much lower, 20% or lower, and the differences between the degree of urbanization are small and insignificant. But if you look at safety walking alone at night, there we see big differences. And these are not in favor of the cities. I mean, many things are better in cities if you look at income, education, etc. But safety is definitely considered lower. And it's only in the rural areas that people tend to feel more safe walking alone at night. The cities are consistently lower, and sometimes the differences are quite big. Even in the high-income countries, you can clearly see that people in cities still feel a little unease. Now, I alluded to it earlier, the fact that, because we have such a simple definition that looks at the critical mass of people living nearby, it captures, in a sense, the agglomeration economies. And here there's 2 examples of that. These are private services by and large, and you can clearly see the urban gradient. Access to the internet, much higher in cities, also obviously much higher in high income countries because it costs money to provide, it costs money to pay for a subscription. So you see that those investments have paid off. But in all four groups, you can see that gradient that, you know, if you don't have a lot of people there, if they're very dispersed, they're less likely to have that option or to be able to pay for that option, or a combination of both. And this is also true for bank accounts. Mobile money accounts are trying to change that, but even there we find this urban gradient with much lower shares in rural areas and the highest share in the country typically in the city. So again, you see an issue where having that kind of access to financial institutions is very much driven by distance and density, and very apparent here. Now, of course, in these times of COVID lockdowns, you know, access to the internet is quite critical to make sure that you can maintain your activities, maintain your work and stay in contact. So that's really a big question mark there, especially in the low middle income countries and the low income countries. Moving on, we have had a lot of discussions about urbanization and economic development. There's definitely a consensus that cities tend to help. They lead to more innovation, they lead to a better matching on the labor market, gives people an incentive to get an education, sparks new ideas, innovation spread more rapidly, you know, new products get developed there. So there is a big argument that cities can help productivity, can help growth. And typically, if you use national definitions, we find a strong correlation between GDP per head and the urbanization level. Often we also find a correlation between the GDP per head growth and changes in urbanization. But I want to put a big health warning here. A lot of the definitions actually integrate aspects that are directly linked to the level of economic development. India, for example, has a maximum share of male agricultural employment to become urban. So if you have too many of your male population working in agriculture, even if you're in a settlement of 100,000, you're going to be rural. And a lot of countries have that. And actually, because high shares of agricultural employment are linked to low levels of GDP, it basically means that on one hand, in your definition, you have an indicator that makes urbanization linked to high GDP and low urbanization linked to low GDP. And then if you put GDP on the other hand, well, obviously that's going to strengthen that link. Also, a lot of countries include the requirement of a certain amount of infrastructure, or higher level urban services. And again, those are things that you can typically only afford if you're relatively affluent, if you have a higher level of development. So a lot of these things in the national definitions tend to reinforce that link. I'm not saying that link is not there, but I think it exaggerates it. And then academics have tried to come up with other definitions because there's a lot of frustration with the national ones, or a realization that they're not so useful for international comparisons. Not saying they're wrong. But the two common approaches that I've seen out there, one is either using nightlights or the other one is using built up area, suffer from that same kind of circular argument problem, right? Nightlights are found in developing countries to be a pretty good proxy for GDP. And changes in nightlights tend to link to changes in GDP. But so if you use something that's linked to GDP to define urbanization, and then you see if urbanization is linked to GDP, again, you're having the risk that your definition is exaggerating that link, is really overemphasizing that narrative. Built up area is a very traditional element. It's even found in a lot of national definitions as well. Like the Nordic countries have this definition of buildings that are less than 200 meters apart. That's how they define a settlement. This kind of comes from history, right? Because we used to not know where people lived. We knew where buildings were. We had maps of buildings. We had cadasters. We had no idea where people were. We just knew total population in a municipality or a census enumeration area. But as you saw, that those change a lot in size and are difficult to use to define small settlements. So people used to use built up buildings to identify settlements. The difficulty is built up areas tend to expand per capita as countries become richer. And as a result, what happens is that if you use built up areas to define settlements, you're going to make poor countries too rural, you're going to make rich countries too urban or too city. So this is a bit of a complicated graph. Let me talk you through it. So on the left-hand side, we calculated the degree of urbanization population share in rural areas. And then we calculated looking at all the cells with very little built up, below 25%. And so the lower the income, the bigger the difference was between the degree of urbanization and the population in rural as defined by built up. So for example, in low income countries, population in areas that are less built up were almost 25 percentage point higher than the rural estimate based on the degree of urbanization. And then if you look at cities, built up areas of at least 50%, in high income, the share of population living in those highly built up is 15 percentage points higher in high income countries than as calculated by the degree of urbanization. Okay. Maybe it's a little bit complicated. I can send you a blog where we explain it in detail. But the main message is if you use built up, you're going to exaggerate the urbanization rate of high income countries and you're going to underestimate the urbanization of low income countries. And that's why we think it's better to go to the core of what is a settlement. And the core of what is a settlement is the proximity in space of people, not buildings, people. Now, do we still find a link between development and urbanization? Yes, we do. And we find it in two ways. On the left-hand side, you can see that the share of people living in a city and their commuting zone goes up as the income goes up. And so you can see low income, it's only like 33%. High income, it's on more than double, 70%. And that increase also is in more and more due to the population in commuting zones. As countries become more affluent, they build more infrastructure, allowing people to commute into the city, giving them access to maybe larger dwellings and a different living environment. And then as a result, you see a spreading of cities, of the labor markets into areas that are not properly a city, but are part of the city labor. The other way you see it is also in the size distribution. In high-income countries, you see a lot of population concentrated in metropolitan areas of more than 1 million. Almost half the population lives there. If you look at the low-income countries, it's only like 12%. So very low shares of population living in very large metropolitan areas. And you can see the middle-income countries have a fairly even distribution across the metropolitan size rates. And then you see that much steeper distribution in the high income. So we kind of see a transition in the size structure of metropolitan areas as incomes go up. I alluded to it in the beginning. Will we see a massive wave of urbanization as was announced by the UN World Urbanization Prospects? Actually, when we look at our data and projections that we did up to 2050, not so much. In the dotted lines here, you can see the UN projections based on national definitions. And it shows already that rural areas would start declining in terms of total population already today, and that urban population would grow much faster. By degree of urbanization, we actually see the continuing growth of population in rural areas, though at a low level. Also, the population in towns and semi-dense area continues to go up. Cities grow, but less quickly than urban areas do. So, I mean, questions about, for say, the development agency like the World Bank or the European Commission, the question whether rural population will shrink by 300 million or increase by 250 million, that's an important question, right? we need to know, we need to understand how this will change. And also, again, how much will this urban population increase? Is it going to be by 50% or is it going to be by 30%? Again, big differences in the implications of the type of investments and the locations you're going to invest in. And also with our projections, we see as the overall population growth rate slows globally, as we go through this demographic transition, we also see the urbanization growth slowing down. So we start to see slowing down of city growth rates, of town growth rates, and rural growth rates over time. So what are the next steps? We've got this endorsement by the UN Statistical Commission, but that could very easily end up as a paper recommendation. And we really want to make sure that more people use this, apply this, and understand it. So we're going to try and help as many countries as we can to apply this definition, and using their official data, the latest census, the population grids. In the EU, we already use this definition, although that distinction between towns and suburbs and villages, etc., we haven't done yet. We want to integrate these definitions into the UN Sustainable Development Goal indicators, because we think it's critical that if we want to be able to compare these indicators, we have to use harmonized definitions. And this one is one that can easily be applied. And if we start producing more indicators and not just SDG indicators, we can really start to understand how different settlements are evolving. The UN Statistical Commission has asked us to report back on the implementation of this. How many countries have been able to implement this? Are they satisfied with this? So that's why we really want to make sure that we help that. But I think the key thing, much more from a policy perspective, is, okay, how can we use this new lens on the territory to understand how to improve quality of life, be it in rural areas, be it in villages or towns or cities? And I think this gradient, this urban gradient, is very useful for that. I think typically we imagine policies, and we have urban policy, we have rural policies. Most countries don't have a town policy, or it's a bit ambivalent. Is this part of the urban domain? Is this part of the rural domain? And I think now we have a much better way of understanding how these different settlements can function and can provide services. And I want to conclude with two examples of that. One is a study that we're doing, European Commission with the OECD, it's together with the Joint Research Center and the DG for Regional and Urban Policy, is looking at access to services in towns and rural areas. And so in particular, we're focusing on healthcare and education, and to see how that access is organized currently, how that access is likely to evolve, what's the impact of aging, what's the impact of population decline, how will we have to restructure this offer in the future. And so this lens that we have through the degree of urbanization is particularly useful to have that discussion about, okay, where do you want to consolidate? Where do you want to expand those services, and how can you do that? And again, also the role of broadband is going to be very important there to provide some of these services already in part digitally. And then another study which we have recently published called the Low Carbon Accessibility in European Cities. It's a working paper, it's on our website. And there we've looked at access to public transport in European cities, also looked at the performance of public transport, the speed, the vehicle kilometers traveled, the size of the blocks to see if it's a fairly walkable city or not. And really with this harmonized definition in combination with better data on public transport through GTFS, we can really make a very rich analysis of what is the offer, who can walk there, where can you get, how many people can you reach in a half hour, 45 minutes, etc. So that's another study I would recommend you to take a look at. Okay, so this kind of wraps up my presentation. I'm looking at Ava. I think I did okay on the time.
Perfectly on time. 20
Very
seconds
good.
left if you need it.
Well, I would just say I'm looking very much forward to what the discussants have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe before I give the word to Alexander, there was one kind of clarification question about your presentation, referring to one of the first figures or graphs that you have shown about the accessibility that decreases, accessibility to public transport that decreases with the distance from the city center. And someone was wondering why this is not a linear figure, why there were this kind of strong bumps. Maybe you can clarify this quickly before we move.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I won't pull up the graph, but what we do is we look in bands. So we look in each band of a circle around the city. So it's not the full circle, but it's that little thin strip. And so depending on whether that strip covers an area with, you know, a train station or a metro station, it can go up or down. You often see that a city will have a clearly defined core, then it might have a green belt where it goes down, then you might have another town where it goes back up. So it really depends on the population distribution in that band, why it goes up or down. So it's not cumulative, it's reported separately for each distance band around the city center.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, now please, Alexander, if you would like to ask some questions, and maybe if you can kind of focus on your 3 most pressing comments so that we also have time for Lewis to respond again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eva. And thank you, Lewis, for the presentation. And I have to say that I was specifically delighted when I was reading 4 or 5 weeks ago for the first time the new definition that you added gray into the mix. The colleagues here at the Delft will not be surprised that I'm specifically interested in what I call, well, territories in between. So these towns and cities, or if you talk about Europe, it's a network of smaller towns and villages. And I was very much interested if you could already speculate a bit on if this official edition of this class will also have an influence, or perhaps has already an influence also on EU policies. I was thinking about specifically, well, we're talking now a lot about the reshoring of manufacturing, of certain types of production again, and this for sure will not happen in the big densely populated cities because of conflicts of use and so on. So I was wondering this one. That was the first question. Eva, should I get the second immediately or answer?
I think you can maybe ask all your questions.
Okay,
and we give again to us.
Good. And the second question concerns the definition of metropolitan areas. Well, where you use well, not you, it's rather commonly used, right? Commuting areas and labor markets. And I was wondering, because based on our recent urban metabolism studies that try to answer to circular economy challenges, we included in this definition also other flows, specifically waste flows, because they are more local than material flows. And we came to the conclusions that they are always bigger. These functional areas are always larger, significantly larger than the metropolitan areas, but nevertheless smaller in many European cases than the country scale. So as metropolitan areas are very often those tiers that are driving the circular economy policies, I was also interested in your opinion on that. So I'll leave it with 2 questions so that we have enough for the others.
Perfect, thank you. Lewis, if you would like to respond, please.
Sure, I've been busy taking notes so I don't forget anything. I'm glad that you like the gray and you like the fact that we identified towns. We've had long-standing discussion about the fact that we have a very dense network of medium-sized settlements. Indeed, it's useful to identify those in a consistent manner. The impact on EU policies is a good question. We have a EU agenda, urban agenda for the EU, I have to say it right, where we increasingly focus on urban areas, and urban areas include towns. So this is clearly a part of that. What we also see is that as countries industrialize, it tends to move out of the main cities, out of the main metropolitan areas. These places are too expensive, too congested. They want to provide, have a location with good access to road and rail transport, not too expensive land. So typically they move to smaller towns. For example, in Germany, you can see many major industries located in relatively small settlements. And so speculating on whether we will see significant reshoring is difficult. COVID seems to suggest that indeed, global supply chains can easily be disrupted. We are more vulnerable to those. Will that have a big enough impact to really lead to a significant amount of reshoring? I don't know. Also depends on how quickly we make the low carbon transition. If we really are able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions rapidly and switch to new sources of energy, then transport costs are unlikely to have a big impact on the amount of reshoring. On the contrary, or if a bit slow or technology doesn't allow us to reduce that quickly, it might become that, the carbon tax at the border will have a big impact, will give an incentive for more industry to locate and produce goods within the single market. And so then we would see a significant increase. And I would indeed expect to see that in towns more so than in large cities. On the flows, I love that question. What are the flows that you consider? Ideally, we think of the commuting flow as a proxy for more flows. Ideally, I'd like to base it on all flows of population, also people commuting or, traveling to school or education or to a theater or to a sports game, so that you really cover all the different functions a city has to offer. Material flows are more complicated. They can come from far away. We were just talking about global supply chains. They can come from China. They can come from Brazil. Energy even cross borders. We have an energy market. We see electricity being shipped around or moved around. So it's less obvious to see where to draw those boundaries. But in principle, the idea behind a metropolitan area is that it's a functional urban area. So we're trying to cover as many functions as we can, and also especially functions that have a proximity requirement. Material goods, manufactured goods, even food don't have such a huge proximity requirement, only if it's highly perishable. So, depending on how many of those flows and what thresholds, you would end up with areas that could be significantly larger than even countries or the union. So I think it's an important dimension, but I think the question really is, which of the flows have the highest proximity requirement? And we do hope that the metropolitan areas are fairly good proxies for that.
Thank you.
Would you like to respond again, Alex? We have some minutes left if you want to clarify something more. Or
no, I think it's very much on the same line. Therefore, we reduce the flows, as I said, to really the residual waste and the building or construction waste flows, so that we have those flows that have a proximity with the city and so on. But nevertheless, we saw that it's wider, significantly wider than the commuting areas. So, but yeah, I think
that makes sense. I mean, if we look at the provision of water, for example, would be another good one. Wastewater treatment, those are important aspects and typically organized quite locally. We have looked into finding better data on that, but the geography of wastewater treatment areas is hard to really pin down.
Yes. Indeed. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I would like to invite Martin to give his most pressing observations, please.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Thanks to Lewis for such an informative presentation. And this is an important subject from a policy perspective, particularly the policies that I've been looking at, which are defined as place-based models. And you can see how what you've described, Lewis, fits into the sort of policy initiatives that are emerging under the broad heading of place-based policy. Just to give a couple of quick examples, clearly the city region or the metro in regional policy systems, this is clearly something important. I know from the United Kingdom, so on how to support constellations of cities in a functional economic space. Another example is how policymakers are looking at issues such as climate change, demographic change as cross-cutting issues that highlight the commonalities rather than dichotomies between rural and urban areas. So looking at synergies and coordination of measures that are being introduced in both areas and how they can work together. That's clearly a thread. I also see support for small and medium-sized towns that have, as you've described, this intermediate position. in terms of employment, service provision between cities and rural communities. It's another strand that's really prominent. And obviously the integrated territorial investments and sustainable strategies that the EU is supporting in the current period. So I think for all these examples, the sort of classifications and what you're doing has clear application there. In terms of three very quick points that I can make, so one on delineation, one on evaluation, and one on integration, really quickly. Firstly, in terms of delineation, from the work that we've been involved in and looking at ITIs is work on the spatial coverage of these policy interventions. So how to set these functional geographies in place. And maybe if you could say a little bit more about potential tensions between functional boundaries and administrative or political boundaries. Thinking from work that we've done, looking at where, for instance, a metropolitan level isn't in place, there isn't an administrative level there, it can be challenging to develop some sort of coordinated approach. For instance, in ITIs, there are countries where there's been quite fragmented approaches because with lots of small strategies based on municipalities because there was no agreement on how to get a functional space there. So it's kind of tensions in that respect, which I can see the work that you're doing helping to address, but it's just more a comment that these tensions or issues can be there, particularly where there's resource allocation decisions being made. Some municipalities can fall out, some can fall in, and so on. And that's a challenge. My second point was on evaluation, and I really like the point you made about overcoming the circular argument, where you can take these other themes or issues out, and that allows us to analyse or compare internationally or within countries at these specific issues and how policy is or isn't supporting and working on that. My question under this heading is, or my comment is, whether this classification that you're working on can help mobilise cities, citizens, communities in the evaluation process, perhaps by producing more meaningful geographies for them to interact with. I know this is something that at EU level and at member state level, the participation of the local level, local authorities, as I said, citizens, interest groups, and communities seems important. Does developing this sort of meaningful geography help in that way? My last point was about integration. Obviously, these place-based policies sort of try to combine or include cross-cutting issues, working across policy sectors and fields that don't often or always talk to each other, and so on. This also applies to differences between the spatial planning community and the policy community, between EU funds, domestic funds, and so on. So it's just to pick up on the point that you're making about creating consensus. Obviously, this is really challenging, but I see real value in the development of a consistent framework like this. You know, creating a common language, not just in terms of international comparison, but across policy sectors, EU and domestic measures, policy and planning, communities, and so on. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope you took some notes again, Lewis. Many points to respond to, but we have some time, so please take your time.
I turned off the microphone so I could type without bothering you with all the noise. Thank you, Martin. Really, really good points there. Let me try and pick up a few of those. Let me start with the delineation question. There's definitely a tension between functional geographies and political and administrative geographies. It is inevitable when you do this type of work. It's also part of the reason we want to do this kind of work. When we first developed our definition of metropolitan areas, the OECD also estimated a fragmentation index. You know, how many municipalities are in that metropolitan area? Is there a political body that coordinates it? And they definitely recommend that, you know, especially for land use decisions, transport decisions, economic development decisions, the metropolitan level is more important. You know, it's a necessary level, and many countries don't have it, or it's the wrong scale, or it's the wrong size, or they don't have a lot of prerogatives, it's just a talking club. So implicit in these functional definitions, there is the suggestion that, hey, maybe organizing policies at this level can help. This is a very treacherous area. You know, the EU is, I think we shouldn't overestimate the impact and the power of the EU. We are, as international organizations go, quite unusual in the sense that we have a budget, and we have a parliament, and we have a council, but nevertheless, we don't influence these things into great detail. But through the ITIs and the sustainable urban development, we are trying to encourage and facilitate and allow experimentation of countries to work across administrative boundaries. And it is true that it's important to find boundaries that are meaningful. That takes me to your second point. This whole process for me has been a bit of a journey of discovery, I would call it, and it has had very surprising moments. I remember going to South Africa for the very first time and meeting with the Statistics South Africa and saying, well, you know, we've got this strange definition that we applied to your country, and we identified these places as your cities, and we identified these as their population. And they looked at our city list and they're like, well, that's just banal. These are our cities. And I'm like, yes, it works. You know, you aim for something that is recognizable to the general public. And Brazil looked at the map of the towns and the villages, and they, you know, if you put this on a map, and you see a little intersection of a road, typically, you know, you see a little cluster there, you see a little town or a little village there. So it was kind of like pearls on the string. And when you put these places on the map, typically they have a name. So, you know, all these kind of things emphasize that we're capturing something somehow. And I don't want to take too much credit into it. I think it's almost by accident. And as soon as you start working with the grid, this appears quite naturally. But we tend to find places that have a name, places people can identify with. And so we've come a project, Name That Town, where we've tried to map all the towns in Europe. And I think we're up to 10,000 or more. And then we tried to identify a name for them. We've put them on the map, asked for comments. But in most cases, it tends to work. The villages are harder. They often are a combination of a couple of hamlets. They don't work as well. But the towns have a meaningful geography in people's mind. People identify with these places. But that doesn't mean that those are the best places to organize policy at. I think intrinsically policy should be multi-level, and it's important to have local policies, and we're trying that with our new policy objective 5, closer to the citizens. I like the idea of citizens taking active role in funding decisions and policy decisions, and typically those are easiest to organize at the local level, but you also need regional, metropolitan, or national policy. So it's not an either or. It's really important to have that happen at multiple levels. One of the last things I would say on that front is also that the NUTS regions that we use are statistical regions, and depending on the country, they may have a broad recognition, like the German Länder, everybody knows what they are, or the Belgian provinces. And in some cases, like in the UK, they were weird combinations of other regions, and they had terribly long names because they had to combine a whole bunch of shires into one. And that lack of recognition is an obstacle. So I think it's important to work with geographies that people recognize, and geographies that have some kind of functional meaning. And those two goals are not always compatible, but I think it's important to keep those in mind. And I think the last thing I would say for cohesion policy, we are a policy that's primarily dedicated to helping less developed cities and regions in Europe. And it's tricky in that sense because there's this presumption that cities are always doing fine and that they don't need help. Why are we helping them? But actually, through this geography, we can also look at the impact of cities on growth and on productivity. And we can see actually there's quite a few cities that are struggling. losing employment, facing the impacts of the recession. So I think it helps us look beyond the stereotypes and identify that you can see incredibly affluent rural areas, but also very poor ones. You can see incredibly successful cities, but also cities that have faced decades of decline. And that maybe comes to my last point. We've used the degree of urbanization to also assess votes for parties that are against EU integration. And we find a very consistent urban gradient. Cities generally have fewer people voting for parties against the EU. Even when we correct for education, for income, for age, after all those corrections, there's still something that makes people in rural areas more concerned about EU integration than elsewhere. Discussed this also with DG Agri, and this is one of the topics they want to address in their vision for rural areas, because it is odd that, we have the common agricultural policy, we have the rural development policy, we have regional policy that invests heavily in rural areas, that despite all these policies, we still see a clear indication that there is still a lot of concern about EU integration in rural areas. So this is a lens that can be used in many surprising ways, and sometimes you find unexpected things, but I think it shows some patterns or some phenomena are just structured that way. And then when it looks at demographic change, you can see very clear patterns by degree of urbanization, and also the impact of climate change. For example, the impact of climate change on cities is going to be much higher. They're going to suffer more from heat island effect, and so tropical nights are going to be rougher there. They're more exposed to floods. They're more exposed to storm surges. And that's typically the areas that tend to grow more rapidly. So not only are cities more exposed to these problems, that exposure is increasing more in those areas than elsewhere. I could talk far too long. I'll stop there and give some more people the opportunity.
Thank you. Would you like to briefly respond, Martin, or should we take some questions from the audience?
No, please. No, just say thanks to Lewis for the response.
Thank you. I saw that Evert posted at least 2 questions in the chat, and since his camera is also on, maybe he's happy to post those questions himself.
I'll unmute myself then. Thanks so much for a very insightful presentation and doing this important work, Lewis. It's I think we will really benefit from this work as well as academics. I was just thinking about your last point about investing a lot in regions by the European Commission and not seeing this rewarded with a positive stance towards European integration. It could well be that the European funding cannot compensate the lack of attention maybe that national governments give to their regions. And maybe that is because, they see all these statistics showing that urbanization is a kind of good development strategy. Because of the positive link between urbanization and a lot of development indicators. So maybe this all becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, this urbanization trend, if national governments start to invest much more into urban areas because of these figures. Is that a concern in Europe? Or in Europe? That's a very general question, but
yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and it's a question that we have debated a lot inside the Commission, and that we continue to debate. Maybe first I'll start with sharing another bit of analysis that we're about to publish. So with Andres Rodriguez Pose, we've been looking at the impact of cohesion policy and anti-EU voting. And there actually we find a positive impact, i.e. more investment from cohesion policy tends to reduce the tendency to vote against the EU. So it's not like all our funding doesn't have an impact on votes, but some of it may not have enough impact, or may not be appreciated enough. A lot of that also comes through questions of perceptions and visibility and the willingness of politicians to acknowledge at least shared ownership of some of those projects, if not an acknowledgement that the vast bulk of the funding sometimes comes from vilified Brussels. But on the urbanization and the lack of investments, this is a really tricky point, and I think it's important to get the perspective right. And I think when you look at the cities and the rural areas, I think there are two perspectives that are at odds with each other. And one is the input and the output perspective. If you would look at access to healthcare, for example, you would see that we spend more on providing access to healthcare in rural areas because the population is more dispersed, so we need more locations. They don't have the same critical mass or economies of scale, so it costs more. But nevertheless, access is still lower in rural areas. So a city resident may look at it, why are we spending so much here? And a rural resident might look at, why do I still have lower access? And the strange thing is both of them are right, but it's just a different perspective. Do we aim to provide the same output equality, or are we not willing to subsidize particular locations, and do we want to put input equality as the threshold? And I think it really depends on your perspective which ones you might prioritize. I am totally fine with not going for input equality. Different places have different cost structures. Some things will cost more, some things will cost less. Some places get lucky in the economic development roller coaster one decade, and they might not be lucky next time around. I definitely think solidarity is an important principle, and it's an important principle of the policy I work for. But at the same time, I think output equality is something which from a spatial perspective is impossible to achieve. In a city, you can say, I want every kid to live within a short bike ride of a city. In a rural area, you would have to build a high school for every student to achieve that. So intrinsically, the spatial distribution of the population makes certain things impossible. Just like air quality is going to be better in a rural area most of the time than in the central city. That is an output inequality, which is an almost logical consequence of spatial concentrations of activities and populations. You can attenuate them. I, as an active cyclist, I'm absolutely outraged by the lack of compliance with the EU air quality directives, for example. There's lots of things we could do to improve urban air quality, but it would be a lot to ask to say we want the same air quality in downtown Brussels as we get in northern Finland or in northern Sweden. I mean, so intrinsically the degree of urbanization creates certain opportunities and limits, and there are different opportunities and limits. And I think we have to acknowledge that those are there, because we'll never be able to go for a pure equal living environment. It's just that different places often different mixes of opportunities and problems. One last thing on that, when looking at demography, for example, we see very clear evidence of a kind of life cycle. Younger people move towards cities to get a higher education, get a little bit of experience, and then they move away from the big city, maybe to a smaller city or a town. And when they retire, they move to a pretty scenic, low cost, high quality of life location in the countryside. And so we've been looking at rural regions in Europe, and we can clearly see the outflow happening starting from 18, and then they start coming back when people turn 40, and even more so when they turn 65. So I think that's great. This is what the union was built to do. It was built to provide people the mobility and the liberty to move between different places and take advantage of the different qualities and opportunities they offer. So for me, what is key is not to make sure that everybody wants to stay where they are. It's key that places offer the best quality of life possible. And if people want to move from one place to another, different parts of their life, that's great. If I look at some cities, I think some of them are outrageously expensive and utterly unnecessarily so. And the same can be said of some very attractive countrysides where housing costs are absolutely ridiculous. But I'll conclude with a nice quote. I forget who said it, But the democracy is a difficult balance of trying to please half of the population that wants housing costs to go up and half of the population that wants them to go down. Because in principle, you know, people who own a property think they get more affluent when it goes up, and they'll vote for parties that limit supply. The people who need to pay rent or buy a first house don't obviously want them to go down. So I think there's again a really tricky balance to strike. But hey, I'm talking a lot. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm not sure you asked the questions you post in the chat, but maybe I still take some other questions. No. Maybe I can summarize because there are two kind of related questions here about the tensions and kind of controversies of this proposal of yours. And the first one is Nikolai Christian Surubaru is asking, to what extent would governments across the world be willing to accept this definition? And especially from the perspective that redefining urban areas statistically could have a strong impact on the political competition or voter constituencies, and also the distribution of public resources. So that's the first part of the question. And the second part relates to the tensions that you hinted at between the international organizations that work together to arrive at this definition. So what were the key issues that of tension between those, and who would lose out from this indicator being mainstreamed and urbanity, rurality being redefined in that way?
Good questions. Let me try and give sharp answers to those. From the get-go, we really tried to emphasize that this definition was an additional one. It was not ever meant to replace national definitions. National definitions can be more specific, they can use more indicators, they can be aligned with particular policy needs or requirements. So this was never meant to replace national definitions. And this was also the biggest bone of contention. So we were in New York, in the UN headquarters, discussion with all the chief statisticians of the world, and several took the floor to say, you know, we want to support this, but we want to reiterate this is not and will not replace our national definition. So there is a very keen appreciation of national definitions, and this will not replace them. This process has also taught me things which I didn't realize, for example, that even within countries, urban definitions may differ quite a bit. For example, in the UK, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland each have their own definition of what is urban and what is rural. It's not that different, but it's not the same. Also in Egypt, different states have different requirements of what is urban or not. They even have requirements of the number of stories buildings have to be before you can be urban. So, you know, long story short, yes, it is a very treacherous terrain. People also identify emotionally with a certain description of the settlement that they live in. When we first applied a degree of urbanization, first applied the regional rural classification to the EU, northern Sweden turned out to be intermediate and not rural. And they were shocked. And actually, let's be honest, they were a little upset. We tried to reassure them that they were still remote, but they reran the numbers and they found the same results. So I think they grudgingly accepted it. But I think these identities people have are hard-felt. I don't necessarily think there's any intrinsic drawback to being described in one way or another. But the big reason for the obstacles is the tie-in to money. Wrote a blog with the World Bank, and many of the things that they flagged up is sometimes they don't want to make a place urban because then the government would have to spend a whole bunch of money to give them schools and courts and healthcare that they're entitled to as an urban district. And if they can't afford that, even though there might be a very large settlement, they remain rural. Also, on the other hand, a lot of places might like being rural because they might get subsidies for electricity or for teachers or for doctors because it's harder to convince them to move to a rural area. So because the designation of your area is tied up with a lot of rights and funding, touching that is hugely problematic. And basically, you know, everybody in the room panics. And so for me, it was bit of a steep learning curve to see that that was such a sensitive topic, and so we really had to find a good way of avoiding too much conflict on that. But there was definitely this fear and this concern that being flagged as a particular type of area would change what you were entitled to, change what you receive, and have an impact on your quality of life. For me, the other thing, which is a hard thing to try and get people's hand around, is that when we try to capture the spatial concentration of population without looking whether certain services are present. And a lot of places were like, well, yeah, but this place doesn't have all these urban services, so it can't be urban. And so in a way, we tried to estimate the potential of being urban, or the potential of a settlement, rather than the practice of a settlement. If you have a lot of poor people together, you know, it might not have the purchasing power to support certain higher level services, but there's still a lot of people there. And so for me, I think what we really are trying to capture is how many people live nearby, much rather so than is this an affluent place. So we're trying to separate those two, but that creates tension, because if you classify a place as a city but it's fairly poor, they don't necessarily self-perceive them that way, because they don't feel like they've got the theaters or the fancy shops or the banks or the lawyers that they associate with the city. But it is useful to be able to place them on a continuum. And then I've always tried to convince places, like, don't think of the service as part of your definition, but think of it as a characterization of your settlement. You know, which cities lack a hospital in your country? Which towns lack a doctor in your country? Which towns have a high school? Which ones do not? And in that way, I think it's a better way to approach it, but it's still contentious. On the tensions inside the 6 international organizations, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but there were definitely, you know, different interests which are normal. For example, FAO was particularly concerned about the rural classification, and they worked a lot on developing that and testing that and identifying villages. OECD had worked a lot on the metropolitan definition, so that was one of their main concerns. And then how do these, you know, definitions interact? Suburbs was a tricky word. A lot of people in developing countries were like, suburbs? Give me a break. We don't have suburbs. We can't afford suburbs. You know, they have this image of, you know, big houses and big yards with swimming pools that you see in outside American cities. You know, so that's what they had in mind. So then we tried to use the term peri-urban, and then they were in Brazil, like, okay, we have peri-urban areas, and also in Africa, and that's a term we recognize, this kind of gray area in between really urban and really rural. So, you know, they were like, okay, that works. So we did that. And the other thing that we had a lot of discussions about, okay, the SDGs still use the term urban, and we do define it. We say urban areas are cities plus towns and semi-dense areas. But at the same time, we say, please don't put them together. Don't make our world black and white again. You know, we'll give you this definition, but please look at the towns separately. Don't clump them with the cities. Also, don't clump them with the rural areas, because these are really different. And I think that was really, you know, that was a lot of recurring discussions about that. But I'm very happy we had those discussions, because it helped us to frame it right, get the right terminology, and really put that strong recommendation out there. Yeah, I know you've always been asked just to give urban, rural, but try and think in more categories. You know, try and think in cities, towns, semi-dense, rural. You can even break it down further. Think of the metropolitan dimension. And then we have even more dimensions, like, for example, remoteness. Remoteness is you know, the distance to a city of a certain size, and driving time is also a very pertinent dimension that you can add on to this definition. And we have a few examples of that. And we know, for example, in Europe, that if you look at remote regions, their demographic development, their economic development is very different. Their economic structure is very different than rural regions, which are closer to cities and metropolitan areas. So that's another dimension that we recommend people add. But it's a little bit hard to decide what's remote for Belgium and what's remote for, say, Kenya or Brazil or Russia. I mean, the scale is a little different. So maybe we leave that up to the countries to decide what is far and what is not.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, but maybe I can still pick two questions from the chat that I also see somehow related. One question was about your opinion on the proximity requirement of work or labor, especially at times when nowadays maybe 60–70% of the population are working from home. And another related question, in some countries, for example, in India, we see quite a lot of migration on a weekly, monthly, seasonal basis that goes far beyond the metropolitan areas. So how is this reflected in your approach, or what would be the ramifications of such a definition for that?
Yeah, on the proximity requirement, I'm curious to see what's going to happen post-lockdown. I mean, I think there are people who are like, hey, this working from home stuff is great. And there's people like, I can't wait to get out of here and get back to the office. So I think it'll make us aware of both the drawbacks and the benefits of having an office. And even if you look at industries where there is, say, more teleworking, most of them still live within a relatively short travel time of their place of employment. You know, it is quite rare for an industry to be able to function purely without any face-to-face interaction. So I think proximity will continue to matter. I do expect people who enjoy it and businesses that allow it will see an increase in the amount of home working, teleworking after the COVID crisis. But I am convinced that a lot of people are very keen to get back to a rhythm which is pretty close to what we had before. I mean, people could sign a piece of paper now, we could go back to, you know, December last year, a lot of people would sign. So I don't think it will dramatically alter the way we work and live just yet. Now I'm blanking, I didn't take notes. Second question was?
It was about the seasonal, weekly, monthly migration within a country.
Thank you. This definition is meant to be applied to the de facto population, so the population found in place when you have a census. And the commuting data also comes from the census, and so those are, you know, pretty standard statistical concepts, but they don't necessarily fit the changing way of commuting patterns and the fact that people sometimes commute for just during the week and then stay home on the weekends. One of the countries mentioned that they have 2 locations for their census, you know, where they're registered and where they actually spend most of their time. Mobile phones do permit better insights in that. Like, for example, here we didn't take into account the location of employment. We could have also have defined cities based on daytime population rather than nighttime population. We don't have reliable sources of that yet, but that may change in the future. And so I think if we get good information of flows and more regular flows so that we can capture not just travel to work, but also other types of travel, and we could capture seasonal changes. I think all those things would be important to consider. In the end, it really, you know, we only work with a few thresholds, and so I think it's actually quite rare for these phenomena to have such a big impact that it would radically alter the geography of your area or the status of your city. I mean, you know, if we estimate that your city has 100,000 people, but actually, you know, on a weekday it's 120, the city's still there, the geography will probably be more or less the same. It's all the places that were above the threshold. Might be a few cells that get added, but in the end, I think the general outline would be still quite similar. But I do think it's more challenging for countries where you do have big seasonal shifts to decide, okay, which data do we use, how do we get that data, and how do we apply that definition, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions, but I want to extend a big virtual applause to our speakers and discussants and of course the audience. And this is the end of this seminar that is organized jointly by SPS and EPRC Delft.